Order, order. I call Dave Robertson to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Vickers. Can I say what a pleasure it is to be able to lead off in this debate with you in the chair. Before, though, I turn to e-petition 657935, if I may beg your indulgence to just mention that obviously today is International Holocaust Memorial Day and represents the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Given that it is the 80th anniversary today and the fact this is very possibly the last significant anniversary that many of the survivors will be here with us, I think it is really important that we do mark today because we must never, ever, ever forget the crimes that were committed in the early part of last century. And I stand foursquare behind the work of the IHRA in making sure that we never forget and that we can turn darkness into light. Thank you. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 657935 relating to speech and language therapy. Today I'm introducing this topic that is something which we so often take for granted, and particularly those of us who will have the opportunity to contribute to today's debate. Communication and our ability to speak and our ability to put our point on the record in the way that we do is so fundamental. Now, it's fundamental to members of Parliament because of the jobs that we do, but it is so fundamental to everybody across this country and, in fact, across the globe. The power of communication is our ability to speak, to express our thoughts, our feelings, our hopes, our needs, and our politics. It is, in its most simplistic definition, how we connect with each other. However, for some people, it's not so simple. The words are there, the feelings are there, the thoughts are there, but they just can't quite find how to get those words out. And that is so difficult for so many people. And I think it is anything that we should ever overlook, because that ability to communicate and that need to connect with people is true of every single human being. And supporting people to make sure that they can always find those words and they are always able to reach that communication and reach out to others is something that I am sure everybody would support. And that's where speech and language therapy steps in, not just as a treatment, but as a lifeline, as a way to help people find the words. It's about helping people find their voice and helping them overcome the barriers that keep them from being heard. If we can't communicate, we can feel invisible, we can feel alone, which in itself is a huge challenge. Speech and language therapy is more than just a clinical service. It is absolutely vital to huge numbers of people across this great country. It's the bridge between silence and expression, isolation and inclusion. And whether it's a child who is struggling to form words, or an adult recovering from a stroke, or someone with a lifelong condition affecting communication, speech and language therapists are the unsung heroes in helping people rediscover their ability to speak, to listen, and to engage with the world. Last week, I had the great privilege to speak with Mikey, who created this fantastic petition. And one of the things that really struck me throughout that meeting was not just how thoughtful and how well prepared and how well read and how on top of every single part of this Mikey was, but actually in his determination that this wasn't just about him. This wasn't about Mikey's treatment, this wasn't about Mikey's journey, although he is very able to communicate that and very able to discuss that with people and very willing to do so. It was really clear that actually this isn't about Mikey. This is about Mikey standing up for people who find themselves in a similar situation to him. And I think that when you get the opportunity to meet somebody who is a true campaigner and is willing to spend their time and spend their efforts on supporting people across their community, it's something that we should all applaud. And I would very much like to place on record my thanks to him for the work that he does. When I spoke with Mikey, though, he told me that actually he's one of the lucky ones. A year and a half after he was diagnosed with apraxia, he was offered an hour of speech therapy a week. That became a huge boon to Mikey's ability to take part and Mikey's ability to develop and to just be part of the world. But he feels lucky at that, because for so many people, the ability to access speech and language therapists is a postcode lottery. And it shouldn't be a matter of luck. Getting people the help that they need with something so important should be a minimum. And in fact, the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapy recommends for Mikey conditions 4 sessions per week. Now, Mikey didn't raise that in terms of not feeling that he wasn't being supported, but he was using that as an example of actually where the current provision and the current support that's available doesn't meet the need, even for people like Mikey, who in his own words is lucky to have the support that he's had. The waiting list for speech and language therapy for adults was, in August of last year, just over 23,500 people and over 67,000 children and young people. Every single one of those lives can be touched, and every single one of those lives can be immeasurably improved by making sure that they have the treatment that they need, because that treatment allows them to rebuild the confidence that they may have lost. And that was absolutely something that Mikey told me, is that actually after having his treatment, his confidence grew. He's less anxious. He's able to speak publicly with strangers and friends. He was able to get a job and catch up in education. And it's all down to the speech and language therapists who supported him in reaching his goals. It's not all down to the therapist. Obviously, Mikey is responsible for a huge amount of what he's done. But it's all his ability to be able to express himself and be able to show the world where he's coming from and what he does is down to the language therapists who supported him with him. I did also meet with the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists and Speech and Language UK last year. And the most striking thing that came out of those meetings was actually how important it is to look at this issue through the lens of social justice. The most striking piece of data that they shared with that is actually 25% of all children when they go to primary school have some form of diagnosed or undiagnosed speech, language and communications needs. But if we look at the most deprived areas across the country, that percentage rises to 50%. On top of that, we also have the fact that over 60% of children in young offenders institutions have communication difficulties. Now, that is too stark a reality. That is too stark a piece of information to be accident. There is something here which could be driving that. And I think by reaching out and making sure that people are able to express themselves, are able to engage with the world at large, be that school, be that friends, be that family, be that wherever it is, can support people in helping them access the world and prevent them from going down that path, which can end up with them making some difficult decisions and finding themselves incarcerated. But it's not always just about young people. There are a number of adults who've developed conditions such as dementia, Parkinson's, which is very close to my heart and I will touch on a little bit later, and actually long COVID. And that's something which, obviously, as we approach the post-pandemic world, long COVID is something which we will all be talking about a lot over the coming years. And actually, the speech and language difficulties that can come with long COVID is something which has driven demand since the pandemic, although there was obviously a large amount of demand for speech and language therapists before that. If I can touch briefly on Parkinson's, I have a very close family member. My mum suffers with Parkinson's, and going from a woman who spent almost her entire adult life communicating in her second language. Mum learnt English to go to school. They spoke Welsh at home for Mum, but since she moved to England and brought me and my brothers up and lived there, she spent her whole life communicating in her second language. Mum was also fluent in French, and seeing her go with the where she's gone with her Parkinson's, to just not be able to find the words it's a real challenge for all of us who know my mum. And helping her to find that word and communicate herself is something that I think everybody who knows mum would want to support, and I'm sure anybody who's got a relative in a similar position would also be very eager to help support with those. Parkinson's UK did an audit of their members in 2022, and of the people they spoke to, just 40% have access to a speech and language therapy, and only 15.5% were referred to therapists in the diagnosis state, and only 8% were seen at the diagnosis stage. That's one example, and there are many, many, many conditions. I I beg the House's forgiveness for raising one which is such a significant importance to myself, but it's the one where I have a lot of direct experience, and I think that was why I picked on that one condition, but there are many which can be supported through speech and language therapy. If I can just return to the postcode lottery that I mentioned, there are areas of this country where ICBs are spending less than £1 per person. I think 58p was the smallest number that I saw. But actually, the best funded areas for speech and language therapy, the ICB was spending £16.35 per child who was receiving therapy. That's a vast difference. Now, I'm not going to try and say that ICBs aren't doing their job, and obviously there are regional disparities, and ICBs have got to cut their cloth according to the funding that's available. We are all aware of that. But when you see such a significant disparity of around 32 times the amount being spent in one area and another, it does highlight that actually for far too many people, it's a real fight to get the support that they need, because the funding isn't there. And I think I'd be very interested to hear the Minister's response to that, about anything in the long-term 10-year plan for the NHS. There's something that can be done there to set minimum standards, or whether there's anything that the government is intending to do to hopefully level the playing field between different areas. Because for many people, especially those from disadvantaged communities, they live in areas where services are scarce and where waiting times are long, and that can exacerbate some of the issues that those communities face, as well as the individuals affected. But it's not always just about funding. And we know that the answer isn't always just to put more money into the system. Where it's needed, it should be there. But actually, recruiting and retaining speech and language therapists is so vital, because no amount of funding in the world can replace a human being who's actually doing that role, and the skill and the training and the care that those people have for the people they are supporting. There is a shortage of therapists in our system, and many are leaving the profession due to burnout, insufficient support and unsustainable workloads. And when I spoke to the Royal College, they were very clear that actually recruitment is one side of this coin, but retainment is absolutely a part of this as well. It's not just an operational necessity, but it's actually how we not only increase the number of speech and language therapists there are available, but make sure that the more experienced people can train and support and mentor people who are less experienced in getting through those grades from grade 5 to grade 6 and so on. A survey by the Royal College found that 17% of speech and language therapy roles are currently vacant. That's a huge number. That's almost 1 in 5. And actually, by making sure that we have the right number of people here to support this vital care that people need, it can have such a profound effect right across the country. The biggest shortages are amongst Band 6 and Band 7s in the NHS, the more specialist roles. But across the board, therapists are saying that they want to do this job. Nobody goes into healthcare for the money. Everybody goes in there because it's a vocation, because something they really want to support their community and support people where they really need it. And they really want to be able to do that. But in order to do so, we've got to do something on caseloads. We've got to do something on making sure that people are able to devote enough time to each of the people that they see. To close, Mr Vickers, I am very proud that the government will be bringing forward a 10-year plan to offer a vision of a healthier, more resilient NHS. But I think how well supported this petition has been, and given the importance of it to the people who are in need of speech and language therapy, I'm very eager to hear that the government is taking this very seriously to make sure that speech and language therapy is fully integrated into that 10-year plan, so that we can look much more at preventative care, get community services to deliver the support where it's most needed, and prevent those acute issues developing. Ultimately, this debate, and I'm very glad to see so many honourable members and right honourable members from across the House here, it's an opportunity for us to talk about speech and language therapy, make sure that it's got the place that it deserves in the heart of our health system. I'm sure there's much more that many others will like to say, and I very much look forward to the honourable member opposite and his contributions. But on that basis, I so move. Thank you, Mr Vickers.
I remind members that they should bob, as indeed they are doing, if they wish to be called during the debate. The question is that this House has considered e-petition 657935 relating to speech and language therapy. Sakib Bhatti.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a great privilege to serve under your chairmanship. And can I just pay tribute to the member for Lichfield? I thought he gave an excellent speech there. I can't think of a single thing I actually disagree with him on. Although I might wait till we read the Hansard just to double check that. But I thought he gave a very passionate speech, and he spoke very passionately about his own mum and the situation with Parkinson's. Like many members across this House, issues of special educational needs and speech and language therapy are not new to me. They're not new to my inbox. So I think this is a really timely and important debate. It's particularly important because of the hard work of one of my constituents, Mikey Akers, who is in the gallery here today, along with his mother and with other friends who I will also mention. And he was the instigator of this petition, which is very much the reason why we're here. Mikey first came to see me on 13th of January 2022. And little did I know at that point that this young man would be such a giant when it came to standing up for children and adults everywhere who've been affected by speech and language conditions. And in many ways, this young man has given voice to many, so many up and down the country who, through no fault of their own, don't have their voice. Mikey's asked me was really simple. He looked at me and he said, will you help me raise awareness around verbal dyspraxia? And I'm not afraid to admit I had no idea what verbal dyspraxia was at that moment. But of course I said yes, because for us as members, it is one of the easiest things that we can commit to, using our platform to raise awareness about issues that particularly affect your constituents, but others across the country too. I went away to investigate verbal dyspraxia and see how widespread it was, and what I found out was that actually there's a huge lack of awareness around verbal dyspraxia, and yet there were friends of mine, parliamentarians in the last parliament, Mr. Chairman, who suffered from various forms of dyspraxia, which I found out when I raised Mikey's issue at PMQs, and I had parliamentarians come and speak to me about whether they had some form of it or they knew someone who did. And very simply, for those who don't know, verbal dyspraxia is when a child has difficulties in being able to make and coordinate the movements needed to produce speech that is clear and easy to understand. I then said about, like the Honourable Member opposite, it's been meeting with the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, Dyspraxia Foundation, and many other expert organisations and expert practitioners. And I'd also like to draw attention to Gillian Rudd, who's in the audience here, who's a senior lecturer at Birmingham City University, who's training future speech and language therapists, and I will also touch upon workforce. Indeed, she herself contributed to the Burko 10 Years report, and it was her petition back in 2018 which garnered 11,000 signatures at the time, which led to a Westminster Hall debate on this particular topic. So Gillian came to see me in 2020, and I'm so pleased that I've been able to at least highlight her work and support her in all the work that she's been doing. Since my first meeting with Mikey, I've been able to raise the issue of speech and language therapy and verbal dyspraxia in the House on a number of occasions, including at PMQs. And I'm pleased that in conjunction with Mikey, the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, and Chris Kamara, Mr. Chairman, who you may be aware of is a very well-known footballer and commentator, we were able to hold the event in Parliament, in the previous Parliament, calling on the government to do more to support speech and language therapists. And just to, because I talked about verbal dyspraxia, Chris, and I hope you won't mind me saying this, and he's spoken about it in public, suffered, or during lockdown, suffered from apraxia, and in the role that he had, where voice and speech matter so much, the intonations, being able to get your thoughts out. I'm not going to try and copy his most famous lines, but they matter so much, and he was so brave about the way he spoke about it. So Cami and Mikey were very kind enough to invite me onto their documentary, Lost for Words, which is on ITV Play. And anyone who wants to get an understanding of some of the challenges families face across the country. I know Georgia Leckie is here as well, who's on there, and it's very illuminating about the trials and tribulations that parents and children go through to get the support that they need. Of course, look, as I said, this is an issue that has affected so many of us in this Parliament and in previous Parliaments as well. So the Department of Education previously, in the previous government, had committed £8 billion to special education needs into 2021-22 financial year. And in the financial year 22-23, this was increased by £1 billion to over £9.1 billion. The spending review in 2021 announced £2.6 billion over the spending review period to 2025 to create more than 30,000 new high-quality school places for children with SEND nationally, more than tripling the current capital funding levels, or the previous capital funding levels, to over £900 million to 24-25. This was a significant transformational investment, which I was very proud of, and it also supported local authorities to deliver new places in mainstream and special schools, as well as other specialist settings. And it would also have been used to improve the suitability and accessibility of existing buildings. Of course, none of this is to say that there isn't more that needed to be done or that needs to be done going forward. There was also a £2.6 billion capital investment in high needs provision that was announced in October 2021. And that was to deliver up to 60 new special and alternative provision free schools. And this was in addition to the 48 special free schools already in the pipeline, and over 90 were already open. In fact, we've had a number open in the borough of Solihull, which I represent, and a recent one in my honourable friend for Solihull West and Shirley. In March 2022, the government announced high needs provision capital allocations, which amounted to over £1.4 billion worth of new investment, which was focused on the academic years of 23-24 and 24-25. So my first question to the Minister, and I hope you can provide some clarity, because of course there has been a change of government, a change of priorities. Will he be able to lay out the funding based on those numbers, and whether that funding will be increasing going forward, and what his intentions are? In March, the previous government also published its SEND AP improvement plan. The improvement plan set out what the government would do to establish a single national system to deliver for every child and young person with special needs and disabilities from birth to age 25, so that they could enjoy their childhood, achieve good outcomes, and were well prepared for their next step, whether that was employment, higher education or adult services. Could the Minister highlight whether that plan has continued, or has that informed current government strategy, and how the government intends to take those ambitions that we had forward? Look, it is no secret that councils are under great strain, and so I'm hoping the Minister, as much as he can highlight what the intentions are in coming years to support local councils to alleviate the strains, especially when it comes to SLT and with the integrated care boards. The Honourable Member mentioned the demand on workforces, and this has obviously been a perennial issue, and the RCSLT briefing for this debate highlighted that as well. How does the government intend to alleviate pressures in this field? Does it intend to help fund more places, especially at the university level, because obviously we know these are really complex issues with very high skilled people that are needed? I also just wanted to raise a few questions that I think Mikey also had. One of the key things he raised with me from the very first day I met him, actually, was about the lack of awareness in the teaching profession and also in the health profession amongst GPs to trying to identify cases of verbal dyspraxia. I know the Minister might not be able to answer on the educational side, but perhaps he might be able to highlight what he might be thinking about going forward in terms of making sure health professionals are able to be prepared to identify some of these really serious issues. Of course, I have to ask this, will the Minister also agree to meet with myself, Mikey, RCSLT, and because of the cross-party nature of the member for Lichfield as well, given the way he's opened this debate. Perhaps the Minister could also highlight the time frame for any increases in spending, and as the member for Lichfield said about the retention of workforce, what his thoughts are in terms of making sure that we keep more of the people that enter into this profession. A key thing about policy, of course, is the metrics that we use to assess those policies. So perhaps he could highlight how what would be what are the metrics for a successful policy around speech and language therapy. So we have some measures, and the House members in the House are able to assess that going forward. And I hope the answer to the next one is yes. But does the government recognise the economic benefits of being able to get people and young people and those who are young at heart to be able to have better speech and language therapy and being able to contribute to the economy? look, I'm going to finish where I started, and I want to encourage people like Mikey and others who he inspires to continue to campaign on this issue. It's, you know, there is always more to be done, and he really is a legend. I met him a number of times. I thank him for allowing me to support him on his journey. And I'm going to end with some words that Mikey's got, because he said, I raise awareness of verbal dyspraxia and apraxia, so those who share my diagnosis now and in the future never feel the loneliness that I felt growing up. Thank you.
Serena Brackenridge.
Thank you, Mr Vickers, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd also like to begin by thanking my honourable friend for Lichfield for bringing this important debate to the House today. But I must also thank Mikey Akers, all campaigners and the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists for their tireless efforts in bringing this critical issue to the forefront and having the priority that it needs to have. I heard remarkably that when Mikey tabled this petition on the Parliament website back in March 2024, something like over 10,000 signatures were secured in just 16 days. But I'm not surprised, because communication is at the heart of who we are. It's how we connect, how we learn, how we work and build relationships. It's a fundamental human right. And just as vital is the ability to be able to eat and drink safely when swallowing becomes difficult. For deaf people who already face enormous barriers, access to timely and appropriate support is even more crucial. In September 2024, more than 64,000 children in England were waiting for speech and language therapy. In my own constituency of Wolverhampton North East, children and families are facing unacceptable delays and limited access. Behind each number is a child struggling to communicate in the classroom, a young adult trying to rebuild their life after a brain injury, or a stroke survivor who feels isolated because their voice has been taken away. And I would like to share the story of Samantha, one of my constituents who knows this struggle all too well. Samantha is a former modern foreign languages teacher in Wolverhampton. After a stroke during the pandemic, her ability to speak 4 languages and her independence was severely impacted. Samantha is mobile. Her disability is hidden, but you would know after speaking with Samantha. Yet accessing the specialist speech and language therapy she needed was an uphill battle. Samantha's story is not unique. It's a reality for far too many people across the country. And let's not forget the workforce challenges. Speech and language therapists are invaluable, yet there simply aren't enough of them to meet the growing demand. Despite efforts like the Speech and Language Degree Apprenticeship, we are still falling short. Private therapy is out of reach for most families, leaving NHS services overwhelmed. The current system is underfunded, overstretched and unprepared for the future. Meanwhile, adults in the Black Country Integrated Care Board are waiting far too long, with over 1,000 people on waiting lists in November 2024. So what do we need to move forward? 1, increased funding to meet growing demand. 2, a robust workforce plan so we have enough skilled therapists to support everyone in need. And 3, equitable access to therapy across health, education and criminal justice sectors, no matter where you live. Investing in speech and language therapy doesn't just change lives, it saves money. Early intervention can reduce the need for more costly services down the line in health, education and criminal justice. So, Chair, I urge the Minister and my colleagues to listen to the voices of campaigners like Mikey, like the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists and people like Samantha. Their message is clear. We must work at pace to tackle the crisis in speech and language therapy. So let's make sure that no one in Wolverhampton North East or anywhere in this country is left without a voice or the support that they need to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Not being able to articulate your thoughts verbally is, I suspect, not something many of my colleague parliamentarians suffer with, but unfortunately it's the truth for hundreds and thousands of people in this country. And speech therapy, as mentioned by the Honourable Member, who I'm so grateful for bringing this debate into the Chamber, is not limited to children. There are countless adults in need of these services, stroke survivors relearning how to speak, and that is why it's such a pleasure to speak with Chris here, who is a true hero in the footballing world. People with cleft conditions or those living with dementia. And I'd like to thank again the Honourable Member for Lichfield for spotlighting long COVID as well, because this is an issue that is going to definitely be with us for many years to come. The need in the adult sector is significant, but today I want to focus on children because they represent our future, and without intervention at this critical stage, the challenge they face will only grow. I have not had the pleasure to meet Mikey, but I would like to know if this resonates with him. That if you can imagine a child starting school for the first time, where friendship and bonds are made, and the classmates are eagerly raising their hands, making friends and joining in chatter in the playground, this child remains silent. Not because they don't want to speak, but because they can't. Their words are locked away, their thoughts trapped. Thousands of children face this challenge daily, and they are getting left behind, not because they lack potential, but simply because they lack support. And this is the silent struggle of thousands of children in our country. Speech, language and communication difficulties are not just a health issue. They are really a life issue. They are affecting mental health, academic success, affecting employment, relationships, and there are barriers to participating fully in our society. Over 369,000 pupils in England were identified with speech, language and communication needs in 2023-2024. This is a staggering 64% increase since 2015. And yet, as of November 2024, more than 65,000 children were waiting for speech and language therapy. Nearly half had been waiting for over 12 weeks. The impact of these delays cannot be overstated, but really worryingly, in socially deprived areas, upwards of 50% of children start school with impoverished speech, language or communication. These delays snowball, creating challenges in literacy, learning and, most importantly, social integration. And what is really concerning is that research is showing that more than 60% of young offenders have difficulties with speech. Is this the postcode lottery that Right Honourable Member for Lichfield was talking about? The cycle of disadvantages starts with communication barriers, and it can end in exclusion, isolation, or even worse. This is now a crisis. Speech and language therapists are overstretched, underfunded, and working in systems that fail to meet the demand of support of local needs. And yet there is a solution within reach. Speech and language therapy changes lives. It is not about helping children speak clearly, it is about unlocking their potential. It gives them tools to learn, connect, and thrive. It breaks down barriers to education and opportunity. With timely intervention, children can overcome these difficulties and go on to succeed in school, work, and life. In 2015, the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists commissioned research to estimate the benefits of speech and language therapy compared to the cost of not doing it. The results showed, this was in 2015, for every £1 spent on speech and language therapy, it delivered £2.30 in healthcare savings. Speech therapy is not a cost, it is an investment in the future of our society. So we need urgent actions. Firstly, we need increased investment to reduce waiting time and ensure every child, no matter what their background is, gets the support they need. Secondly, we need improved workforce planning that addresses the shortage of speech and language therapists across all the sectors: health, education, social care and justice. And thirdly, universal proactive provision so that support is fully preventative rather than reactive and limited. These changes align with the government's stated priorities. Communication is fundamental to all areas of public policy. It touches economic growth, an NHS fit for the future, our safer streets and breaking down barriers to opportunity. This is a moment to decide whether we will act Will we allow these children to struggle in silence, or will we give them a voice? Lastly, I'd urge the government to meet with Mikey Acres and the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists to discuss workforce retention and development. Let us invest in our future. Let us make sure every child has a chance to be heard, to succeed and to thrive. Thank you.
It's a privilege to serve under your chairmanship. And I want to also thank my honourable friend, the member for Lichfield, for tabling this debate. And beyond that, to pay tribute to Mikey, I've been privileged to work for many years with young people, putting them at the heart of leading change, and it is always brilliant to see that happening. So congratulations, and I hope that you'll start to see actual results, because I feel like from what we've been hearing, you've been working on this for a long time and perhaps sit there frustrated that you've not seen change happen quicker. It's not an exaggeration to say that high-quality speech and language services can transform lives, because supporting a person to communicate can open up a whole new world of opportunity for them. Communication is an essential aspect of life for all ages, as we've been hearing, including those for adults who experienced major setbacks due to their medical events. But I'm going to focus my comments today on the need for excellent speech and language provision for children and young people. A vital part of this government's mission is to break down barriers to opportunity for all children and to help ensure that a record number of children start school ready to learn. A key component of this approach will be to better identify those children who may need additional support with their language and speech development. And Speech and Language UK have found that 1.9 million children are struggling with talking and understanding words, which demonstrates the scale and importance of this issue. The investment this government is making into increasing the availability and standard of preschool childcare, as well as family hubs, will, I hope, lead to more opportunities to support these young children with their early language development at an earlier stage. However, many of these children will need access to high-quality speech and language therapy to help them progress, but also for their families to be supported in knowing how best to encourage and aid their child's development, as I recognise often parents feel a little bit left out in the cold and unclear how they can best support their children when they're facing challenges. This support will be absolutely crucial to ensuring that no child is left behind in their educational progression, because we know language skills are the foundation for literacy development and further learning. I was really delighted because I've seen the impact firsthand in schools I've worked with about the decision that the Secretary of State for Education has already taken to further fund a year of the Nelly programme, and I hope that the education team will continue to support that going forward as one of the parts of tackling this bigger issue. But I want to take the opportunity today to ask the Minister how the government is further working alongside education colleagues, because we know that it's by working together that we can enable children who need that formal speech and language therapy to access this without the horrifically long waiting times they currently experience. And for a second, just to talk a little bit about the specific challenges within the North West. It's no surprise to me that the majority of constituencies with a high level of signatories did fall in the North West. Right now, around 45% of children and young people who were waiting for speech and language therapy had been waiting for over 12 weeks in November. This compares to 28% on that waiting list in the east of England. The latest figures available show that 2,672 children and young people in the Lancashire and South Cumbria Integrated Care Board area were waiting for speech and language therapy. And this is a damning statement on the inheritance that we received from the opposite benches, further perhaps demonstrated by the almost empty benches opposite, that earlier we heard the Shadow Minister, the Shadow Secretary of State for Education, making a big noise in the chamber, but not taking seriously the challenges that they've left with us and how we're going to tackle them. The regional disparity is adding another level of disadvantage to children growing up in my constituency of Hyndburn. And they, like children, all children, deserve the right to be supported to learn. I think it's really important to be careful when we're speaking about children with special educational needs and disabilities, that we do not suggest their educational performance or communication skills are due to some internal difference or lack of ability. It's the systems and structures around them that we must look at and fix in order to make sure that every child and young person has that same access to opportunities and to fulfil their potential. It is important that we wrap around support for families so the government can make better use of the standard 2-year checkups to unlock pathways to support. But time and time again, I hear of children and families in my constituency who are on pathways for not just weeks or months, but years and years, with no access to the HCP that they might need, not getting the other wraparound access to services that are required to be able to provide the intervention and make sure that child has the best possible chance in life. So it is welcome that the government's mission to build a health service fit for the future will look to design a system which meets the changing needs for our changing population. But can the Minister again share a little bit more on how speech and language services will feature in the current national conversation on that 10-year strategy? Effective speech and language interventions can reduce the need for more intensive and costly healthcare services down the line, and as other honourable members have mentioned, has a significant positive return on investment in the longer term. Investing in that early screening diagnostic services will help identify speech and language issues at a young age and allow for more effective interventions. But it's not just about the effective intervention that helps them to access their language and communication skills. It's to do with that young person's confidence, that ability, as we've heard, to make friends and to start school with their best foot forward. I know that ministers across the government appreciate the crisis that are affecting the SEND education system. We've had a 140% increase in the number of children and young people with EHCPs, but outcomes have stagnated. More money has been putting in, but we're not seeing any better results for the children impacted. And that is why I welcome the commitment that this is not just about investment, but also about the right reforms. I'd like to ask the Minister more about the closer work, as I mentioned before, about closer working relationships with education professionals, and not just how that happens at the top of government, but also on the ground. Where's the opportunity with the Schools Rebuilding Programme to be able to look at the co-location of education and health services and therapy, and making sure that's built into the design right from the start? I know that the head teacher leading on the rebuilding of Hyndburn Academy in Hyndburn is really open and keen for this thinking, so it'd be great to hear the Minister's views as to how that will be rolled out nationally. There are, of course, many wonderful examples of inclusive schools, but many parents have felt forced to explore seeking an EHCP for more specialised speech and language support. So have you made an assessment, has the Minister made the assessment of how a focus on speech and language specialised support in schools, as well as inclusion, could help create a system where parents do not always have to go through a formal written process to secure the resources that they need? And this might tackle the huge challenges that we face in that part of the system. We cannot simply solve the problems in the SEND system without increasing support for children struggling with speech and understanding words. Finally, I just wanted to close in saying that my comments are focused a lot of language development and formal education. But I've had the immense privilege of knowing children in my life who are non-verbal, but wonderful and profound communicators. Communication comes in many forms, and that is why I spoke about the systems and structures we facilitate around our children to ensure that every child and young person is given the opportunity to thrive. No child should be held back from the stronger social participation, relationships, learning and well-being that can be forged with the right support. Thank you, Mr Vickers.
Conor Rand.
Thank you very much, Mr Vickers, and I'd like to echo the congratulations to my honourable friend, the member for Lichfield, for securing this important debate, as well as all the campaigners who worked tirelessly on this issue. And I'd like to thank everyone who signed the petition, especially the 124 people who did so in my constituency of Altrincham and Sale West, where we contributed more signatures than anywhere else. And that reflects the great number of conversations I've had on this issue with local residents since being elected. Other honourable members and friends have spoken about the fundamental nature of communication to human life powerfully. And it's clear that speech and language therapy can be transformational for those who experience it. We know that around 76% of people who have had therapy says it has materially improved their life. But we also know that it is a service as others have reflected on, that is far too hard to access. NHS England figures show that in September last year, over 64,000 children were on a waiting list for speech and language therapy, and 41% of those were waiting more than 18 weeks. In my local NHS trust, there are around 154 speech and language therapists working full-time. But speak to any family with a relative affected by a communication or language difficulty, and they'll tell you it simply is not enough. And I've spoken to many school leaders locally, especially primary leaders, who are having to make stretched budgets stretch even further to fill in the gaps. The picture we face is stark and reflective of the huge crises in both our National Health Service and our special educational needs system. In 2023, a report from the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists identified significant failings over many years in planning for the speech and language workforce, and this alongside significant cuts to early intervention services under the previous government were reported as driving factors behind the waiting lists for therapy. Waiting lists which in turn piled pressure on other parts of the system and ultimately resulted in a demoralised workforce leaving the job they love and the public going without the support they need. And Ofsted, the Education Select Committee and the Care Quality Commission have all published similar reports that frankly should have set alarm bells ringing in government, but the truth is that not enough has been done. Neither funding nor the speech and language therapists we need have kept up with the 64% increase in the number of children identified as having communication needs since 2015. And with adults, we've tragically seen a steady decline in the amount of speech and language therapy received after a stroke and effectively no dedicated adult service for those with long-term speech conditions. And the challenge for this government is that we must reverse these trends, not just because it is absolutely the right thing to do, but because improving access to speech and language therapy is essential to this government's missions for change, as my honourable friend for Hindburn outlined. Because whether that's breaking down barriers to opportunity in education or getting the NHS back on its feet, giving people the support to communicate effectively is critical. And given the impact that speech and language therapy can have on giving people the ability to return to work, it is hugely important in the national effort we have to boost economic growth. And I know some important steps have been taken and taken quickly by this government, not least the record funding increases set out for the National Health Service at the budget. While I know that there is no ring-fenced central funding for speech and language therapy and that service delivery is in the hands of the integrated care boards, I would like to know, if possible, from the Minister what work the government is doing with ICBs to ensure that that extra funding feeds through the system and is being felt by individuals affected by communication and speech issues. If possible, I'd also like the Minister to address how the government will improve the planning for the whole speech and language therapy workforce and what provision there is to do this in the NHS workforce plan that I know the Health Department are currently looking to update, which is desperately needed across our National Health Service. And finally, I'd be extremely grateful if the Minister could set out the progress being made in delivering the early language and support for every child Pathfinder project, so education settings can increase their ability materially to support speech, language and communication development. These are big and challenging issues for the government to address. But that's why members like me and members on these benches have been sent here, elected on a mandate of changing and rebuilding our public services so they can be there for those that need them. And we should never lose sight of the role that restoring speech and language therapy provision must play in the driving missions of this government. Thank you, Mr Vickers.
Williams.
Thank you for your chairmanship, Mr Vickers, and it's a pleasure to speak in this debate introduced by my honourable friend for Lichfield on behalf of the Petitions Committee. But I really want to start by thanking Mikey for doing all the campaigning to bring this really important matter to this place. And I can't miss the opportunity. I'm also delighted to see Chris Kamara in the room. Being a Stoke MP, my twin sister is a massive Stoke-on-Trent Stoke City fan, so she'll be most envious that she's not in Westminster Hall today. Today, I really do want to emphasise the importance of speech and language therapy to deliver on our government's ambition for childhood development and in supporting children with special educational needs. 10% of all children and young people have a diagnosed long-term speech, language and communication need. And that is why we must invest in these services so they are not held back in school and so that they can communicate confidently with their peers. Now, we know that early language development promotes positive outcomes later in life. However, in disadvantaged areas, like in my own constituency, around half of children start school with delayed language skills or diagnosed speech, language and communication needs. Speech and language therapists provide vital support in clinical settings to children with diagnosed complex needs and SEND. They also deliver universal programmes in early years settings, yet sadly these programmes have been decimated by funding cuts over recent years. Across Stoke-on-Trent and Kidsgrove, our local team at the Midlands Partnership NHS Trust and its organisations like Stoke Speaks Out and Thrive at 5 work incredibly hard to support our children. But sadly, I've heard repeated concerns from local service providers about insufficient funding, rising demand and difficulties, as we've heard today, around recruitment and retention. Investment has simply not kept pace with the increase in the numbers of children with increasingly complex needs and SEND. In Stoke-on-Trent, I was surprised to learn that the average number of children allocated to a single therapist caseload at any point in time is 269, and that's simply not acceptable. Our children and young people really deserve to be able to access clinical services when they need them, yet too often this has not been the case. In 2024, 41% were waiting longer than 18 weeks for therapy, and that's the largest waiting list across paediatric services. And whilst underinvestment has impacted on accessibility and waiting times for clinical services, it has also hollowed out our local preventative services. Now, as scarce resources are being used to meet statutory requirements and to deliver specialist services, we've seen significant cutbacks in universal programmes which support children in early year settings to meet their developmental milestones. We know that these universal programmes have a very positive impact on children's outcomes. Early intervention can prevent children from developing more complex needs, and it can reduce the need for referrals to more specialist services in the future. And that is why we need programmes, and more of them, like Every Child's a Talker, Thrive at 5 and Stoke Speaks Out, which have delivered excellent support to our families across Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire. Now, I'm delighted that our government has committed to a new target. We want 75% of our children to achieve a good level of development at 5. The first 3 years of a child's development are critical for their brain development, and I'll stress the importance of investment in speech and language therapy to deliver on this mission, as well as our plans to reform the SEND system. So I close by urging the Minister to listen to the calls for investment, to tackle the long waiting list faced by people in my constituency, but also to hear the calls to invest in preventative services. Thank you.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Mr
Mr Vickers. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair today. I thank the Petitions Committee for securing this important debate and my honourable friend, the member for Lichfield, for introducing it. And I want to associate myself with his words on Holocaust Memorial Day. I also congratulate Mikey on starting the petition and on his impactful campaign. Speech and language therapy is a vital service that supports children and adults with the development of speech and assists those who have difficulties with eating, drinking and swallowing. As Chair of the Education Select Committee, I will focus my remarks today on access to speech and language therapy for children and young people. Speech and language are vital building blocks of communication, and children who face barriers developing speech and language early in life for a wide range of different reasons can face significant difficulties. Poor communication skills, reduced participation in education, can lead to frustration and challenging behaviour or withdrawal and school avoidance. For children whose needs relate to a difficulty in eating, drinking or swallowing, good and timely speech and language therapy can make the difference between being able to attend school or nursery safely or not. I know the difference speech and language therapy makes in my own family. When my oldest daughter started to learn to speak, it became apparent that she was really struggling to say particular sounds, and that those same sounds, that the inability to differentiate between different sounds because of her difficulty in pronouncing some of them, was having a consequential impact on her ability to read. We were able to seek advice from an open access speech and language therapy clinic at our local health centre, which provided a wealth of advice and some helpful exercises that we could support our daughter to do at home. The clinic was available to us whenever we needed it, and my daughter was able to overcome very quickly the challenges that she faced, and I'm pleased to report that she is now a 19-year-old who is nothing but forthright in her ability to communicate with everybody. Such services are now, such open access services like the clinic that we were able to access, is now extremely hard to find. There is a shortage of speech and language therapists, and children who need speech and language support face long waiting lists in many parts of the country. This is a huge problem because accessing timely support has a significant bearing on the impact that a speech and language difficulty can have over the longer term. Issues that can be quickly addressed in very young children, for example, can become much more challenging to overcome with the passage of time. Early intervention saves money and delivers better educational outcomes. Speech and language therapy sits at the junction of a number of different parts of the public sector. Needs are often identified in nurseries or schools. Local authorities have the statutory responsibility for special educational needs and disabilities support. Speech and language therapy is an allied health professional, often commissioned by the NHS, but sometimes directly by local authorities and schools, and often based in community settings. This complexity and the lack of a clear single pathway of commissioning services is one of the contributory factors to the current shortage and the geographical disparities in the availability of speech and language services. I welcome the government's recognition of the importance of speech and language development in children and the commitment from the Department for Education to roll out the evidence-based NELLI programme in reception classes across the country. Expanding the availability of targeted support to help children who have speech and language difficulties catch up will undoubtedly make a difference. But we know that the earlier a speech and language difficulty is identified, the better, not least because sometimes a speech difficulty is the first indication of wider special educational needs, and because the earlier a problem is identified, the easier it can be to address it. The government recognises this, but there is currently no clear plan to expand the availability of speech and language therapy in early years and community settings. The early years sector is a diverse and disparate sector, and there is a need for clarity on expectations, commissioning pathways and professional development to ensure that very young children can access speech and language therapy as soon as a need is identified. It is not compulsory for children to be in a formal setting until the age of 5, which also underlines the importance of community-based support in children's centres, family hubs and health centres, so that parents and carers can access support readily when they need it. Addressing the workforce challenges within speech and language therapy will also require intervention from the government to make more training places available and to encourage those who have left the profession to return. And I hope that the government will produce a workforce plan for all of the professions related to SEND support so that the professional expertise and support is there for children and families who need it. More widely, Mr Vickers, we have a SEND system which is failing children and their families across the country, with far too many children unable to access SEND support in school, waiting far too long for an EHCP, and often finding that when they get an EHCP, it cannot be fully delivered. Since we have a Minister for Health who is responding to this debate today, I will take the opportunity to highlight that when I speak with parents, teachers, local authority officers and others who are responsible for delivering SEND support, very often they say that within the EHCP, the H is too often absent. They struggle to get the NHS to the table, and there is very weak accountability in terms of the levers that can force them to do so. So can I ask the Minister to look in detail at this issue and to work with his colleagues in the Department for Education to ensure better collaborative working between health, education and social care colleagues in the best interests of children with special educational needs and disabilities? Finally, Mr Vickers, I'll take this opportunity to plug the Education Select Committee's recently launched inquiry on special educational needs and disabilities. As a committee, we recognise the vital role of speech and language therapy within the wider network of services that contribute to effective SEND support. Our call for evidence on SEND is open until the 6th of February, and I encourage all honourable and right honourable members who have an interest in SEND services or challenges within your constituencies to encourage your constituents to submit evidence to our inquiry, including those who have experience of speech and language therapy, so that we can hear the widest possible range of evidence. And as a committee, we can help make recommendations to the government that can deliver a transformation in SEND services across the country.
Lib Dem spokesperson, Dr Danny Chambers.
Thank you, Mr Vickers, for calling me. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I want to thank Mikey for being here today and for all the hard work he's done getting to the point where we're having a debate here. I know it takes a lot of campaigning to get as many people involved in a petition as you have done, so that's a fantastic tribute to you. I'd also like to thank the member for Lichfield for bringing this debate forward. And I was struck by one thing, comment he said was that speech therapy, it's not just a treatment, but it's a lifeline. And that was certainly brought home to me recently in Winchester. Last year, I visited an aphasia support group, and someone called Jez Hodgkinson, who's part of that. There's a group of people who meet every couple of weeks, and they've all got speech issues caused by various types of brain damage, sometimes caused by brain injury, caused by strokes, caused by brain tumours, and dementia. And they were telling me that aphasia affects about 350,000 people in the UK. And Jez Hodgkinson said to me, he said, learning to live with aphasia takes hard work, luck, and lots of support. And this isn't helped by the lack of knowledge of the condition. I'd never actually heard of aphasia until I'd had a stroke, so hence it was important to share our stories, both inside our group and with the wider public, including those with a voice in Parliament. And certainly, my personal experience of living with my father, who had a series of mini strokes, then had dementia, and really did struggle to communicate. He knew what words he wanted to say, but he couldn't reach for them, and it made communication very difficult, especially for a very independent farmer who had quite a hot temper at the best of times. So it didn't help. But all people who have difficulty communicating, whether it's a result of a hearing impairment or special educational needs or conditions like strokes and Parkinson's, they all have the right to participate in society fully and independently. And too often these rights are not fully recognised. And everyone here has talked about how fundamental it is for us to be able to communicate, because we are a social species. We function because we can communicate. But even with my veterinary background, we understand how fundamental this need is, because with puppies who have had their ears cut off or their tails docked, they communicate primarily by body language. And when they lose that ability to communicate, they then cannot socialise, they get psychological issues, they get behavioural problems that last for their entire life. And how much more important is it, for humans who need to be able to communicate with friends and family, and also to be able to access services or interact with strangers on a regular basis, to be able to work and also get a whole education. Because everyone deserves independence and the opportunity to flourish with them and their families supported, so they can express themselves and communicate with ease in a way that is most comfortable to them. So speech and language therapy can make a life-changing difference to the people it supports. It is a vital and overstretched service. We know that in recent years demand has risen at a faster rate than the increase in the number of therapists or the support they can offer, and this desperately does need to be addressed. Because by improving outcomes, speech and language therapy can help deliver better care and actually save money for other parts of the NHS. We heard before about supporting people unable to swallow properly. That can have a significant impact on reducing repeat chest infections. And certainly the member for Leicester was talking about how for every £1 spent on speech therapy, it can save £2.30 on NHS costs, which is when people ask how can we afford to do this, we have to ask how can we afford not to do this. So children and adults alike, they're waiting far too long for speech and language therapy they need. And as the member for Lichfield has already discussed, it is a postcode lottery. There's huge differences in outcomes depending on where you live. And helping people to swallow, eat and communicate is an essential service. And everyone should be able to expect this support if and when they need it. Now, Liberal Democrats, we're pressing for the NHS 10-year plan to address specifically the inadequate access to these speech and language therapies and how it will be improved. We want the government to develop a workforce strategy to end the chronic shortage of speech and language therapists so everyone can get the support that they need. And on a slight aside but related note, we've also long campaigned for more support for those communicating through British Sign Language. We've campaigned for British Sign Language to have equal official status to the UK's other languages, and we're campaigning to provide free access to sign language lessons for parents and guardians for children who are for parents of deaf children. And I was visiting St Peter's Primary School in Winchester recently, and the head teacher was discussing how since the COVID pandemic, they've noticed that there's been a sharp rise in pupils who are struggling to communicate, and their speech and language hasn't developed as quickly as it did before the pandemic. And we need to remember that it's not just people's educational needs that gets affected both by COVID and by speech and language challenges, but it's also their entire social development and their friendship groups as well. So this is something that we're really pleased that you've managed to highlight, and we're really, really pleased to have this debate here today. And I really urge the Minister that we can push forward on this issue as fast as possible. Thank you.
Shadow Minister Dr Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. May I congratulate the member for Lichfield for his introduction of this debate today. And in particular congratulate Mikey Akers, who I understand introduced this petition, for the work that he has done in raising awareness of verbal apraxia, work which will no doubt be helping people right across the country. I know that he's been working with my honourable friend, the member for Meriden and Solihull East, on this issue too, and no doubt this will also be helping people. And I'd like to welcome Chris Camara to the gallery as well, who's doing great work in raising awareness too. And the more awareness we raise, the better it will be for everybody, and the more easily people will be treated for the conditions they have. As we've heard today, language therapists have a wide range of skills for all ages. It is much bigger than speech itself, but also includes swallowing from newborns with developmental delay to the elderly who have had a stroke and may be struggling to swallow afterwards. It's about communication, feeding issues, specific sound delays, stammer, there's a huge amount of work that speech and language therapists are involved in. And I've seen the work they do in my own family with a one child unable to say s, and having to have speech therapy to try and encourage her to do so, with one of the younger siblings consequently having spent much of the time attending these appointments learning to say s about 18 months earlier than she was supposed to. I also had a child that had a stammer and learned who was treated successfully. But I learned from that the whole family needs to be on board to treat the child. I'm very grateful to the support that I got from the NHS speech language therapists for my family. But when I went along, particularly for this child with the stammer, I learned that this was about daily games, that this is something the parent and indeed the whole family had to do. I had to learn to play with my child without asking her any questions, which is actually a lot harder than it looks. I had learned about the importance of sleep. And I also learned that early is better. I remember the speech language therapist talking about this being a groove, like on a record player. And if you got stuck in a particular groove, the deeper it got, from the more times the display went round, the harder it was to jump out of it. And so the importance of ensuring that speech language therapy is instituted early as possible to make it easier to treat the patient. And so I wanted to ask the Minister a little bit about parent resources, because if early is better, then being able to start with some aspects of treatment and management even before the patient sees a speech and language therapist with special guidance would be helpful. And I saw that Hereford and Worcestershire Health and Care had some very good online resources for parents to talk to them about what they can do to help their child with a speech or language condition. The priority of reducing overall waiting times for community services was reflected in NHS England's operational planning guide for 2024-25, and local systems across England were asked to develop the comprehensive plan by June 24 to reduce the overall waiting times for community services, including reducing waits over 52 weeks for children's community services. The waiting lists have reduced from roughly 76,000 last July to 63,000 at the end of the last year. This is still too long. Will this government focus on trying to reduce these waiting lists still further? And does the Minister have a target in mind for next year to see how far he would consider it successful to have reduced those waiting lists? What is also clear, and has been reflected in many honourable member speeches, is that the demand for speech and language therapy has gone up. According to Department for Education data, in 2023, 370,000 pupils had a speech, language and communication need in England, an increase of over 64% from 225,000 in 2015-16. This is not related to an overall increase in the number of school-aged children. So why is that the case? And one could perhaps consider that the more people are aware of the conditions, thanks to active campaigns, and this is a good thing because people are getting referred earlier and treated earlier. But it also would appear that the number of children affected by speech and language conditions has gone up. And I know that the Minister and his government have talked a lot about prevention being better than cure. And I agree with that. So what work has he done to look at the causes of the rise in speech and language difficulties? Looking for some suggestions, in my research came across screen time. What is the effect of screen time? It reduces imagination, peer-to-peer speaking and verbal problem solving. It's also a solitary rather than truly social activity. We know that more children are spending more and more of their time online, particularly young children as well. The families are smaller. Does that mean that people have less time to interact with other children? We have an increased number of bilingual children, and whilst that in itself does not cause speech and language problems, it can cause temporary language mixing at younger ages, in some cases slower vocab acquisition in early years. So what is the Minister doing to find the cause of the rapid increase in the number of children with speech and language difficulties in order that we can prevent them rather than wait for them to occur and then treat them? I also wanted to talk about the Nuffield Early Language Intervention, which I think was mentioned during the debate as well, which is a TA-delivered programme which has been accessed by over 11,000 schools since the pandemic. It's known to improve, it's otherwise known as Nelly, it's known to improve the speech and language communication of the children who go through the programme by 3 months, and that the improvement is much greater for more disadvantaged children. So can the Minister commit to continuing to ensure that children have access to the Nelly programme? Pre-election, I know the Department of Health and Social Care was also working with the Department of Education to ensure that young people with special educational needs and disabilities receive the right support. The collaboration included work together to implement the SEND and Alternative Provision Improvement Plan published on the 2nd of March 2023. And those two departments were also working together on the SEND workforce planning and had established a steering group to oversee this work with a view to completing it by 2025. Can the Minister please provide an update on the steering group's work and what plans it has to commission research into supply and demand for speech and language therapy? In 2023, the Department for Education also launched a 2-year Early Language and Support for Every Child, the ELSEC Pathfinder project with NHS England to improve access to speech and language therapy. Funding for that is due to run out this year. So can the Minister confirm whether it will be reviewed to allow the project to continue and whether the funding will continue to be provided? The Government is also due to refresh the NHS Long-Term Workforce Plan this year. Back in 2023, the NHS Long-Term Workforce Plan set out an ambition to increase allied health professional training places by 25% by 2031-32. But the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists and others have highlighted this is only likely to cover speech and language therapists in the NHS workforce, and the Minister needs to address also shortages in educational and criminal justice settings. So can he confirm what work he's doing with his colleagues across government to ensure that that is the case? I think many speeches today focused on the social speech and language needs of children, and that is understandable, but can the Minister talk perhaps in his wrapping up about what work he's doing to support adults with speech and language difficulties or swallowing needs? And finally, if we're to understand from the newspapers, many aspects of care across the NHS are now to be deprioritised, and the ministers are to focus on one specific target. Whilst I wouldn't expect the Minister to comment on any leaks, can he confirm that speech and language therapy will not see a reduction in real-term resources? Thank you, Chair.
Minister.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr Vickers, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Lichfield, for securing this important debate and for the really passionate and moving and powerful way in which he spoke, particularly about his own mother. And I'd really like to thank him for sharing those personal experiences. I'd also like to thank every member from all sides of the House that's spoken today. I think we have had really compelling accounts about access to speech and language therapy for both children and adults. Yes, of course.
I thank my honourable friend, and my apologies, Mr Vickers, and my thanks also. I had to leave for a ministerial appointment. In 2018, my father suffered a stroke, and the staff at my local hospital, the George Eliot, couldn't do enough for him. They were absolutely fantastic. But I know that my father stayed in hospital longer than he needed to, because that was the only way that he could access the speech and language therapy that he needed and the help to enable him to swallow. It was fantastic to see him recovering that speech because of their intervention, because he'd served for nearly 50 years as a volunteer magistrate. And so to see him now being able to challenge my ideas and give his comments on my contributions in this House is wonderful to see. Last week I held a consultation event in my constituency where a dietitian told me that she felt there wasn't enough ability for her and her team and speech and language therapists to give help in the community. She was quite excited about our ideas for virtual wards and asked me on her behalf to plead with the Minister to make sure that we gave recognition to speech and language therapy in terms of putting more care into the community. And I know that my dad would have been very pleased to receive this.
Intervention should be, I was very generous.
Thank you. I do appreciate that.
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention and again a wonderful example of the personal experience that so many members on all sides of the House have of this service that can be life-changing for so many people, and I pay tribute to her father for for coming through in the way that he has, and I pay tribute to all of those in the community care services, and the care that he received was obviously absolutely vital and life-changing for him, and that's wonderful to hear. Interesting point on virtual wards. It is absolutely right that we are building on the innovation and the opportunities that they offer. Later in my speech, I'll say a word or two about the three big shifts that we are going to put at the heart of our 10-year plan: the shift from hospital to community, from sickness to prevention, and from analogue to digital. And I think the virtual wards are a great illustration of how we can bring those three seismic shifts together in order to transform our health and care system. So I can tell her that the 10-year plan, I think, is the right forum and opportunity, and I would encourage her and actually all members from all sides of the House to get involved in the 10-year plan. change.nhs.uk. Please go on there, and honourable members may also wish to organise roundtables and discussion fora in their constituencies and to talk exactly about the kind of innovations that we're looking to bring to the fore. I'd also, it would be absolutely remiss of me not to pay tribute to Mikey Akers. What an outstanding young man he is, truly an example to us all. And of course also to Chris Kamara and the whole team that are campaigning with such vigour and verve on this vitally important issue. And I would of course be delighted to meet with Mikey and Chris and the team at a mutually convenient time to discuss the project and how to take it forward. As our debate today has shown, speech and language therapists work with people of all ages, providing specialist care and support. This takes place across a range of different settings: health, care and education. And it offers a wide range of communication needs, from children whose speech is slow to develop to older people whose ability to speak has been impaired by illness or injury as a result of Alzheimer's, a stroke or a head injury, for example. Speech and language therapists will also support patients who have difficulties with swallowing and eating and drinking. The variety of support a therapist can provide means that speech and language therapists play a key role in a wide range of care pathways. A speech and language therapist will be a core part of the multidisciplinary stroke rehabilitation team, providing long-term rehab for stroke patients. But it's not just the patients they're supporting. A speech and language therapist will also work with a patient's family and carers on how best to facilitate communication and support the patient, sharing their expertise to upskill the support network of the person that they are caring for. Another example is the role speech and language therapists play in supporting autistic people. They can provide interventions to improve communication skills where needed, or for those individuals that are unable to speak, speech and language therapists can design alternative communication systems. Speech and language therapists will also, as part of a wider multidisciplinary team, contribute to a young person's education, health and care plan. A therapist will carry out a detailed assessment of the individual's speech, language and communication abilities, which will help to determine the additional support that they may need to access education. It is this key role in care and support pathways that creates complexity in funding and commissioning models for speech and language therapy. In some cases, full care pathways are commissioned as opposed to individual services within that pathway, whilst in some areas, community health services are commissioned using block contracts. Both create challenges in clearly identifying specific funding streams for specific services. Speech and language therapy is commissioned locally by integrated care boards and in some cases by local authorities. Funding is allocated to ICBs by NHS England. The allocations process uses a statistical formula to make geographic distribution fair and objective so that it more clearly reflects local healthcare needs and helps to reduce health inequalities. This process is independent of government and NHS England takes advice on the underlying formula from the Independent Advisory Committee on Resource Allocation. NHS England is continuing to work with ICBs to develop their financial plans. NHS planning guidance sets priorities for systems, and the Secretary of State has confirmed that this key document will be published imminently in due course. Each ICB will then commission the services they need for their local area, taking into account their annual budget, planning guidance, and the wider needs of the population they cover. Local commissioners are responsible for ensuring their offer is tailored to the local population and for ensuring their communities are able to access the specific support that they need. NHS England continues to work with ICBs to develop their financial plans to ensure that communities are able to access the healthcare support they need when they need it. So that's by way of illustrating the complex patchwork quilt of systems and processes that need to be gone through in order to deliver the kind of care that is required by the people who know best what is required in their community at the coal face, if you like. But that said, I would also like to offer reassurance that the government is committed to properly funding the NHS. And we recently provided a £26 billion boost for health and social care at the budget through the policies and choices that the Chancellor laid out. We have been clear that funding must go hand in hand with reform, and we will ensure that every penny of extra investment into the NHS is well spent. The Community Services Data Plan, published by NHS England last year, goes some way to improving data about community health services. The plan sets out how the NHS aims to improve the quality, relevance and timeliness of data. This will improve our understanding of demand and capacity across community health services, including speech and language therapy, with high-quality data to generate helpful insight to shape interventions and improvements to services. Data and clear funding lines are not the only challenge facing speech and language services. Our children and young people are stuck on waiting lists, some for over 2 years. Over 65,000 children and young people were on a waiting list for speech and language therapy in November 2024. We know that over 23,000 have been on those waiting lists for longer than 18 weeks. That is simply too long. While waiting times for adults are not as stark as those for children and young people, there were over 23,000 adults on waiting lists for speech and language therapy in November 2024. Now, we hear a lot about increasing demand for speech and language therapy and that our existing workforce is struggling to meet the increase in referrals, and I think pretty much every single honourable member raised that issue in their speeches today. The reasons for this increase in waiting times are multifaceted. While services are still recovering from the pandemic, there's also been an increase in demand. An analysis from the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists showed demand is increasing faster than the workforce is growing. Speech and language therapy also covers a broad spectrum of support. Therapists are often dealing with complex, long-term cases requiring a resource-intensive approach to supporting their patients. And often referral pathways are complex. These referral pathways and the services offered also vary regionally. Now, as my honourable friends have pointed out, we are coming off the back of 14 years of failure that have led to serious workforce challenges. And the reality is that we have a mountain to climb on recruitment and retention. The Speech and Language Degree Apprenticeship is now in its 3rd year of delivery and offers an alternative pathway to the traditional degree route into a successful career as a speech and language therapist. We think that that has had some positive impact on recruitment, but much more needs to be done. We want to remove the barriers to training in clinical roles, which is why eligible students get a non-repayable grant of £5,000 a year. Further financial support is also available for childcare, dual accommodation costs and travel. But we know that this does not go far enough. Training and retention of our talented NHS staff is absolutely key to our mission of rebuilding a health service that is fit for the future. A central part of the 10-year plan will be around our workforce and how we ensure that we train and provide the staff, technology and infrastructure the NHS needs to care for patients across our communities. This summer, we will publish a refreshed long-term workforce plan to deliver the transformed health service that we will build over the next decade and treat patients within the 18-week constitutional standard once again. We will ensure that the NHS has the right people in the right places with the right skills to deliver the care that patients need when they need it. And we must acknowledge that tackling this is going to take time. But we are committed to training the staff. We need to ensure patients are cared for by the right professional in a timely manner. Mr. Chairman, community health services and speech and language therapies in particular speak to the three seismic shifts that will drive our 10-year plan. Shifting healthcare from hospitals to communities, focusing on prevention and embracing digital care. Because effective user-centred services are invariably delivered by multidisciplinary teams which are based in the communities that they serve. The Early Language and Support for Every Child, or LSEC programme, does provide an example of different professions coming together to support children and young people. Local authorities, schools and the health and care system working together in the community to support our children and young people. This, in our view, is potentially a building block for how our neighbourhood health service should be working. 9 regional Pathfinder partnerships are trialling new ways of working to better identify and support children in early years settings and primary schools. We've asked Pathfinders to consider how to make the model sustainable after the project period, and the therapy assistant roles also have the potential to attract individuals to train to become speech and language therapists through the apprenticeship route. The LSEC workforce model focuses on recruiting pre-qualification speech and language therapy support workers into the workforce to improve capacity and knowledge of the workforce that supports children with emerging or mild to moderate speech, language and communication needs in early years and school settings. This is going to be really important as we hear a lot about the challenges our workforce has in meeting the increasing demand for speech and language therapy. Across all community health services, increasing demand and workforce availability are frequently cited as the main reasons that systems are struggling to reduce waiting times, to get on top of the demand, if you like. The interim programme evaluation is due to be published in February, at which point we can explore insights into the effectiveness of LSEC delivery at a local level. Highlight reporting data says that therapy support teams have supported around 13,000 children so far, and just over 1,000 setting staff have been upskilled in delivering interventions. It's an encouraging set of achievements, and I will continue to work with my ministerial colleagues and officials across the DHSC and the Department for Education to support this important programme. Now, I referred earlier to our ambitions for building a neighbourhood health service. We are firmly committed to moving towards our vision for such a service. Community health services will be an essential building block, keeping people healthy at home and in their communities and providing more preventative, proactive and personalised care. Later this year, we're going to trial neighbourhood health centres, which will bring together a range of services, ensuring health care is closer to home and patients receive the care that they deserve. Mr. Vickers, we've heard about the importance of adequate funding and timely access to speech and language therapy services for children and adults with communication and swallowing needs. The importance of these services is not in doubt, nor is the life-changing impact that timely access to high-quality services can have. From helping a child to develop the right skills to engage with education, to supporting adults to regain their ability to speak. So to conclude, speech and language services are facing challenges, but it is vital to have sustainable, accessible and high-quality community health services. And I will continue to work closely with NHS England, with the Department for Health and Social Care and the Department for Education on this critical issue. Thank you.
Dave Robertson to wind up.
Thank you, Mr Vickers. Can I place some thanks, place on the record my thanks to all of the honourable and right honourable members who have contributed to this debate today, starting with the member for Meriden and Solihull East, who made an excellent contribution, as I think we would all expect, and I'd like to congratulate him on his campaigning on this very important issue. The member for let's try that again. Member for Wolverhampton North East for raising the story of her constituent Samantha, who I'm sure will be watching the debate closely. The member for Leicester South and absolutely the member for Hyndburn for reminding us of the importance of supporting the next generation and all those who come after. Member for Altrincham and Sale West for raising the issue of unacceptably long wait times for speech and language therapy. The member for Stoke North for highlighting the caseload faced by speech and language therapists in Stoke-on-Trent and the great county of Staffordshire. The member for Dulwich and West Norwood for discussing the need for early intervention and the remarkable impact that it can have by getting that intervention in early. The member for North Warwickshire for the story of her father's experience in of speech and language therapy. Member for Winchester on behalf of the Liberal Democrats for particularly, I think, for the need of raising the need for awareness raising around aphasia, because I think it's something that doesn't necessarily get spoken about enough in the community. I think that was an excellent contribution. The member for Sleaford and North Hykeham, I think Hykeham, have I pronounced that right? There we go. On behalf of His Majesty's official opposition, for her considered remarks, actually, and avoiding getting into this being a political football, because actually I think it's really important that where we do agree, we highlight that and we recognise that there is often more agreement than people realise in this place, and working together we can achieve those goals. And especially to Minister Kinnock, the Right Honourable Member for Aberavon and Maesteg.
Not bad. Aberavon and Maesteg.
Maesteg. Mum never quite got around to teaching me the Welsh that she speaks. So actually thank him for his kind words around Mum. And for outlining the complicated funding scenario that currently exists for speech and language therapy, the government's desires for the future of this therapy, as an example of the 3 shifts that the government will introduce in the NHS, and as well as the need for people to engage thoroughly with the NHS 10-year plan consultation as a vehicle to securing those changes. And then lastly, just 2 more. Thank you to the Petitions Committee for allowing me to lead on this. It's been a real pleasure, and not least because actually my constituency was the 4th highest supportive constituency of this. But finally, and I'm sure on behalf of all of us who've been able to contribute today, an enormous thank you to Mikey, without whose campaigning we would not be here discussing this. Thank you, Mr Vickers.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 657935 relating to speech and language therapy. As many of that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. The sitting stands adjourned. Okay.